The Grand Monarch Hotel shimmered under the city's evening lights, like a beacon for those who considered themselves the elite. Inside, the golden light of the chandeliers reflected off sparkling champagne glasses, gliding over expensive fabrics of evening attire, filling the air with the scent of power, success, and vanity. Callahan Pierce moved through the room with impeccable confidence, which years in business had made a part of him. At 45, he remained the one who did not tolerate weakness in himself or others. Each of his movements was calculated, every glance was deliberate. Tonight was supposed to be like many before it, an exchange of empty pleasantries, discussions of deals, restrained smiles hiding predatory intentions. But as soon as Callahan took a few steps into the ballroom, something changed. An almost imperceptible tension ran down his spine. Instinct made him look around. And then he saw her. Serafina Lowell stood by the velvet columns, captivating, untouched by time. Her figure in an elegant sapphire dress was the embodiment of refinement, but it wasn't this that took his breath away. Her gaze. God, that gaze. Years ago, he begged himself to forget how she looked at him. Once, her eyes held the promise of eternity, then pain. Now, though, now her gaze was firm, as if she knew something he didn't. Callahan gripped a wineglass, trying to control his breathing. She was supposed to disappear from his life forever. He left her 19 years ago, because she couldn't have children, because the future he imagined became impossible. Then it seemed like the only right decision. He built an empire, created a legacy, wanted a continuation of the family. And she couldn't give him what he craved most. But now, 4 young people stood beside her, tall, confident, 2 young men and 2 young women. They didn't just accompany her, they protected her, their faces, their features. They resembled him. Callahan felt the ground slipping from under his feet. This is impossible. 1,000 questions raced through his mind. He wanted to turn away, ignore this nightmare, continue living in his constructed world. But at that moment, Serafina met his gaze and smiled. Damn, she knew. She always knew. And now he had to know the truth. Callahan Pierce didn't move. It seemed time slowed down, and the hum of hundreds of voices in the room turned into a muffled rumble. His gaze was fixed on them. 2 young men, 2 young women. They stood beside Serafina, clearly her children. But this was impossible. She couldn't have children. He swore he would leave her in the past. He did what he thought was right. But if they existed, did that mean he was wrong? One of the young men, tall, with a cold gaze, the spitting image of his younger self, met his gaze. He didn't flinch. His jaw tightened like a predator ready to attack. Callahan felt his heart constrict. This couldn't be just coincidences. They were his. Serafina Lowell watched him. She saw how his expression changed, how his confidence crumbled under the weight of realization. Part of her wanted to savor this moment, let him feel what it's like to lose control. But another part, she still remembered how his love for her was once all-consuming, how in her darkest night, he was her light, until he betrayed her, until he broke her, and yet now she saw fear in his eyes. Callahan took a few steps forward. His hand trembled, but he wouldn't allow himself to show weakness. "Who are they?" he asked. His voice sounded hoarse, broken. Serafina slowly smiled. She had been waiting for this question for 19 years. "My children," she said. The room grew quieter. The glass slipped from Callahan's hand, shattering against the marble floor. But he didn't even notice. His world had shattered. He couldn't sleep all night. Callahan Pierce sat in his penthouse, looking at the city that once seemed to belong only to him. But he was wrong. In his hand was a phone. He could dial her number. He could demand explanations. But he knew he wouldn't get what he wanted. He had to find out the truth himself. "Patrick," his voice was icy when he spoke to his assistant on the phone, "I need to know everything possible about Serafina Lowell." Immediately. Pause. "About what specifically?" Callahan clenched his fist. "About her children." His assistant exhaled. "Sir, I thought you knew." "Just do it, Patrick." Pause. Then a quiet response. "Yes, sir." He thought he would be ready for any answer. But he was wrong. When Patrick sent the documents the next morning, his world crumbled completely. 4 children. His blood. His legacy. But how? Serafina couldn't have children. She said so herself. So she lied? Or was there more to it? Callahan couldn't wait any longer. He had to see her. And this time, he wouldn't leave without answers. Callahan Pierce stood before the massive doors of Serafina Lowell's mansion, his heart beating too fast. He was sure he could control his emotions, but now standing here, he felt a suffocating heaviness in his chest. He was on the threshold of truth, and it could destroy him. 19 years ago. I can't give you what you want, Cal. Serafina's voice was quiet but firm. He looked at her tear-filled eyes, at her trembling fingers, clutching the edge of a blanket, and didn't believe it. But we can handle it. We don't need... She shook her head. You're lying. You always wanted a family, children, and I... Her voice broke, and she quickly turned away. Callahan stepped closer, touching her hand. I only want you. Her shoulders trembled, and then she pulled away. You'll leave, sooner or later. He wanted to say she was wrong, but he couldn't, because deep down he knew. She was right. Present day. The door of the mansion opened. Standing on the threshold was him, Noah, the young man who looked like he had stepped out of Callahan's past, the very one who challenged him during the gala evening. You came for answers, he said, crossing his arms. But do you deserve them? Callahan gritted his teeth. I have the right to know. Noah looked at him with undisguised contempt. You had the right 19 years ago. Now you're just a stranger. Pain sliced through his heart, but Callahan didn't back down. Where's Serafina? A heavy pause. If you want to talk to her, come in. Inside it was eerily familiar. The same scent of vanilla and jasmine. The same paintings on the walls. As if nothing had changed, except for one thing. Now they lived here. His children. Noah led him into a spacious living room, and there they were waiting for him. Nathan, slightly younger than Noah, but just as confident. Olivia, a cold gaze as if piercing through. Emma, the only one who didn't look hostile. And between them, Serafina. Callahan froze. She hadn't changed. Or rather, she had changed, but only become stronger. Once he saw softness in her eyes. Now there was steel. I knew you'd come, she said. Her voice was calm. Too calm. You knew, and said nothing. What would it change? Callahan stepped closer. 4 children, Serafina. And you. You let me leave without telling me? Noah crossed his arms. You left yourself. That was your choice. I thought you couldn't have children, Callahan almost shouted. Olivia snorted. And you didn't bother to check. Didn't fight. Just left? Silence echoed in the room, because Olivia was right. He didn't fight. He just believed. Serafina sighed, lowering her gaze. I underwent an experimental treatment, Callahan, a month after you left. Callahan blinked. And it worked. It gave me them. She looked at her children. But why didn't you tell me? Serafina pursed her lips tighter. Because you made your choice, Cal. Callahan didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes? Hours? He just sat in that room watching as his children, his blood, looked at him like a stranger. Because he was a stranger. And now, was it too late to fix anything? Callahan didn't know what to say. Everything he believed in was crumbling before him like a house of cards. 4 children he never knew. He spent 19 years convinced he had made the right choice. He left because he saw no future. But the future was here. It stood before him. Too late? Noah looked at him sternly, arms crossed. You want to hear the truth, Callahan? He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Noah stepped closer. You think we grew up without questions? Without the shadow of your name? Callahan opened his mouth, but no words came out. Olivia stepped forward. But do you know what's funny? You would have left anyway, because you're not the one who stays. Her words cut deeper than any blade, but Noah wasn't as harsh. He looked at him differently. with interest. "So what now?" he asked. "Now?" Callahan looked at his children, at the future that could have been, and realized he wouldn't leave. Not this time. Now he knew the truth. But what now? The room was filled with oppressive silence. Serafina said nothing more. Olivia and Noah watched him, but their gazes were too different for Callahan to understand what they felt. Olivia was cold, her posture saying, "I don't need you." Noah, different. In his gaze there was no anger, no pain, but something else. Something dangerous. "So what now?" Noah repeated, slightly tilting his head, studying Callahan. "I don't know," he honestly replied. Noah smirked. "At least that's honest." Olivia sighed. "Noah, do you really think he's trying to make amends? As soon as everything calms down, he'll disappear again." "Maybe, maybe not." She glared at her brother. "You really want to give him a chance?" "I want to know who he is, Olivia." Callahan froze. "You want to know me?" Noah shrugged. "I want to understand what we inherited." His words sounded like a challenge. The next day, Callahan went to their family cafe, a small establishment on the corner of the street, with old-fashioned lamps and the smell of freshly baked bread. He entered, expecting to be chased away, but Serafina just looked at him with weariness and said, "If you're staying, take an apron." He blinked. "What? You want to know them?" "Work." Noah smirked and tossed him a dark blue apron. "Let's see how long you last." Callahan had never worked with his hands. He managed corporations, created strategic plans, conducted negotiations with investors. But pouring coffee and carrying plates? It was humiliating. But he didn't leave, even when the first customer yelled at him for a too-cold latte. Even when he dropped a tray of hot buns and was laughed at by the patrons. Even when Olivia approached, looked at him and said, "You can leave. We won't mind." He gritted his teeth. Number Noah watched from a distance, and for the first time, a glimmer of respect flashed in his eyes. In the evening, when the cafe closed, Callahan stayed alone, cleaning the tables. Serafina stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're still here." He wiped his hands on his apron. "Yes." She stepped closer. "You're not used to losing, are you?" He smirked. "I'm not used to giving up." She nodded, as if deciding something. "All right, then let's see how far you go." She turned and left, leaving him alone with his choice. With each passing day, Callahan understood that words meant little. Here in their world, respect was earned through actions. He had been working in the cafe for a week now. His suits had been replaced by simple clothes. His hands were covered in small burns from hot coffee. His confidence, undermined but not gone. Olivia still looked at him with contempt. Serafina kept her distance. But Noah began to notice. One evening, when the cafe was empty, Callahan saw Noah standing before the accounting books. His jaw was tense. Callahan knew that look. "Something not adding up?" Noah sharply raised his head. "None of your business." Callahan approached, looking at the papers. "Revenue dropped by 12% over 3 months. Noah straightened up. "You're good with numbers, but that means nothing," Callahan thought. "You want the business to grow?" "You're asking if I want to save what Mom built her whole life?" Noah narrowed his eyes. Callahan nodded. "Let me help." Olivia, passing by, smirked. "How? You're going to buy us out like everything else?" Callahan met her gaze. "Number, I'll help you rise on your own." Noah silently studied him, and then he handed him the folder. "If that's true, prove it." It was a truce. Callahan worked on the papers all night. He analyzed expenses, studied competitors. The cafe was losing money because of one weak link: rent. It was overpriced, deliberately. Callahan immediately understood it was the work of business sharks, and he knew how to stop them. The next day, he entered the office of the building manager. There he was met by Lawrence Grayson, an old enemy. Lawrence smiled, lazily leaning back in his chair. "Decided to get back in the game, Callahan? I'm not here for myself." "Is that so?" Lawrence raised a coffee cup to his lips. "But you should understand, the rent terms won't change." Callahan smirked. "You set them 30% higher than the market rate. That's extortion. That's business. That's illegal. Lawrence frowned. Callahan placed a folder in front of him. In this folder, data on all your rental schemes. Lawrence slowly exhaled. Are you threatening me? Callahan smiled. I'm offering a deal. The next day, Noah received a letter. The rent was reduced. He turned to Callahan. How did you do it? Callahan shrugged. I just knew where to push. Noah looked at him for a long time, and then for the first time, he slightly nodded. It was a beginning. Olivia stood by the window, looking at the city lights reflected in the glass. Her world had changed over the past few weeks, but this evening was supposed to be the culmination of it all. She felt that the truth was close, but she was afraid to hear it. Behind her stood her siblings, Noah, Nathan, and Emma. The atmosphere in the room was tense. Their mother, Lillian, sat in an armchair with a glass of wine, but her hands were slightly trembling. Richard stood next to Olivia. He had come a long way to reach this moment. Mom, tell the truth. Olivia's voice was cold. You hid something important from us. Now we want to know everything. Lillian took a deep breath. I didn't lie to you, she said softly. But I didn't tell you everything. Olivia clenched her fists. How is that different? Lillian turned her gaze to Richard. She realized she couldn't hide anything anymore. After Richard left, I was desperate. I couldn't accept that I would never become a mother. But I didn't want my life to end just because one person decided it should be different. She looked at her children, but she was speaking more to herself. I found Dr. Vance. He was known for his experimental infertility treatments. His work wasn't officially approved, but he offered a chance, a tiny one, but a chance. I agreed to the procedure, knowing the chances were almost zero. Richard looked at her intently. Why didn't you tell me? Because you left, Richard, she whispered. You chose to leave before we had any chance. He gritted his teeth. And you decided I shouldn't know? That I didn't need to know about my children? Lillian looked at him, her eyes flashing. You made it clear that a childless marriage was impossible for you, Richard. I loved you, but I couldn't allow myself to hope that you would return. But I would. She raised her hand, interrupting him. You would what? Stay out of pity? Or out of a sense of duty? That's not the life I wanted. And I wouldn't let you return just because I suddenly became good enough for you. The silence in the room was deafening. Olivia stepped forward. But that's not all, is it? Lillian exhaled. She looked at her children. Dr. Vance used an unusual procedure. It required biological material from both parents. Richard frowned. But I never provided any samples. Lillian lowered her eyes. You did, but you just didn't know what for. Richard paled. What did you do? When we were together, you donated blood for one of the charitable foundations my family worked with. I knew they stored samples, and when I learned about the procedure, I used them. Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. I knew if I told you, you would try to stop me. You wouldn't believe it would work. You would tell me to leave everything as it was, to move on. But I couldn't. The silence in the room was ringing. Richard turned away, trying to digest what he had heard. You did it behind my back. I did it because I had no choice. I didn't steal your children, Richard. I gave them life. Nathan clenched his jaw. And you thought you would never tell us? That this wouldn't come out? Lillian shook her head. I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid, but I never thought it mattered. You are my children no matter how you came into this world. Olivia looked at Richard. And you? What do you think now? He was silent for a long time. I don't know, he finally said. I need time. Lillian nodded. Me too. Later that evening, Olivia sat on the veranda of the house, looking at the night sky. Richard came out to her. Do you feel better now that you know the truth? He asked. She shrugged. I don't know. Everything has become more complicated. Richard nodded. But now we have a chance. She looked at him. A chance for what? He took a deep breath. To figure everything out. Together. She didn't respond, but for the first time in a long time, she felt she wasn't alone.